There is something, I suppose, significant from a numerical point of view this year, that we are celebrating the 250 years of the establishment of the chairs here in Trinity College. And it's also the year which is seeing the publication of the 250th translation by Hans-Christian Oeser. So there's a kind of a nice parallelism that's going on there. But Chris, I wanted to sort of begin at the beginning, really, your background, your upbringing. Your father, Dr. Oeser, was a very well-known and respected music scholar and musical publisher. Your mother, Anne Augenstein, was a soprano singer. So you grew up in a household where, music was everywhere. It's not omnipresent. I know it's an interest that stayed with you all your life. Is there a sense for you, for example, when you've devoted your life, if you like, to the music of words as opposed to musical compositions and so on, but has that kind of musical sensibility stayed with you in your life as a translator?
Well, I would say yes, possibly even consciously so, because, if you like, one of my tenets is that even in prose, whatever I translate has to have a musical ring to it. Rhythm is very important, tempo is very important, the modulation of a sentence, etc. And it could well be that it was that musical upbringing that informs me when I sit down to translate something. In fact, a critic once wrote that somehow this family heritage, in a sense, must have informed my approach to translation. Because I hate nothing more than flat prose, but there is a problem because sometimes an original author might choose flat prose to suit their best interest, and sometimes then I am tempted to actually lift the text in the German translation a little bit. And that might be unethical, but it possibly does something for the quality of the German translation, I don't know.
And do you ever find that even the French writer Gustave Flaubert used to talk of his Gaulois. He kind of, when he finished a day's writing, he would read the prose out loud to capture the music of the sentences and alter then the basis. So, do you find yourself doing that? Are you like the Flaubert moments for it?
I don't know whether I can call them Flaubert moments, but yes, for example, quite often my colleagues would translate a whole novel and then go over it and revise the whole thing. I go, if you like, paragraph by paragraph, then chapter by chapter, or before that, sentence by sentence, and I will go back to that first paragraph, and then I do find the little, if like, hindrances, and I will, or infelicities, and I will try to correct that and improve upon that before I move on to the next paragraph. And I do find that reading out loud is a great help. It's in a sense like, for example, you are an actor and you have to, have a line by a certain Shakespeare, you will only realize what that line might be like if you speak out loud. And for a translator, that's a very good exercise. Now, quite often you don't have the time because you're always rushed, so I might actually forego that little exercise, but at least I will go back and read out, not loud, but quietly in my mind.
There was a film that came out at the end of the 1980s called The Accidental Tourist, William Hurt and Kathleen Turner. I don't know if the audience remembers it, but I've often thought of that in terms of how a lot of translators describe how they ended up in the profession, that there's the kind of the accidental translator, like the accidental tourist. So in your case, how did that, so you university studies in Marburg, then you go to the Freie Universität in Berlin, was translation already on your mind at that, or was it something else later?
No, again, accidental translator. I do remember that, I went in Kassel to a humanistisches Gymnasium where we learned Latin and Greek, all gone by now. But, the local newspaper would say when we did our Abitur, our leaving certificate, what do these students want to do? And I just wrote Germanistic, German studies. So I didn't say doctor, medical doctor, or lawyer, or whatever it might have been, Germanistic. And so I actually studied, first of all, to become a school teacher. And then I realized when I did my practical 1.5 years that wasn't for me. I then came to Ireland, and I came with an organization called German Academic Exchange Service. So I was a lector at UCD for 3 years, but then that came and had to come to an end. So the question arose as to what to do then, and I applied for all sorts of jobs, in newspapers, schools, universities. Nothing came of it. So then I decided, because a first translation had been published, a little poem, I decided, try your luck there. And then, it developed step by step. And you mustn't forget, I said Latin and Greek. I also learned English at school, but it was my worst school subject. So very accidental translator that I've become. But in a sense, it was a circle that, came to fruition because it was what I really wanted to do, literature. I had this thing, I wanted to do something with literature. I could have become maybe an editor in a publishing company or something. But then it was this particular thing, because my sister, I have to say, my oldest sister, she, again coming from this musical background, she was a typographer. And I don't know whether you can remember, in the olden days, you had a system called letraset, where you rubbed letters onto the page. And the same thing was notaset, where you rubbed notes onto the page. And that's what she did for a publisher in Stuttgart, Reclam Verlag. And I asked her, my big sister, ask your editor, could your little brother not come in and try his hand on a little translation? And the guy was very kind and said, yeah, you can apply. And I said, I want to translate Thomas Hardy. And he says, no, sir. You start with Arthur Conan Doyle, a Sherlock Holmes story. That is the level. That was my first literary publication then with a publishing company, not in a journal.
And what's interesting is that, going back to that piece in the newspaper, you said that you want to study Germanistic, because very often it's a kind of a fallacy that people have when they want to do translation. They get fixated on the foreign language, the languages that they're going to learn. Whereas in fact, very often translation itself, it's the mother tongue, or the language you're translating into that often presents the most difficult. That's the one that you have to acquire.
Yeah, and in fact, I think that helped me in a sense to embark upon this path. Because, you see, as a school student, I read a lot. I really read a lot of German classics, Schiller, Goethe, and Rabe, etc., etc. And then when I became a university student, because I was very politicized, I read less and less. So whatever is the foundation, if you like, of my translational work was, if you like, accumulated during my school years. So, for example, the vocabulary, the lexicon that is at your disposal, that should be revitalized every day of the week. But quite often you really go back deep into your childhood, youth, and this is what you work with or work on. And I find, for example, today when I translate, let's say, a contemporary novel, we all know that vocabulary tends to shrink with everybody. Nobody writes like Thackeray, nobody writes like Charles Dickens now. The language has become much more simple. So the question is, how do you prevent yourself from having a more and more simple language? And so my own recipe would be read the classics again and again, but you never have the time because, translators are badly paid, as we all know, so you have to churn out the work. And unfortunately, it means that you are using up the substance of what you once acquired in your youth. It's tricky, very tricky. But I seem to be getting along.
Chris, one of the reasons that Trinity, very correctly conferred the honorary doctors on your lifetime's contribution to making Irish literature, better known in Germany, was the fact that you began to translate a lot of Irish literature. Was it a kind of, would you say, an accidental circumstance? It just happened to be in Ireland, so that was a kind of logical thing to do. Or did you yourself feel, for example, in the 80s, early 90s, that there was a kind of a gap there, that a lot of the, if you like, pre-independence classics had been translated into German, but there was a gap in terms of contemporary Irish literature in the German language?
Well, during those decades, I think there wasn't a gap. I mean, I call them the 3 O's: O'Flaherty, O'Fallon, and what do you call it?
O'Brien?
O'Connor.
O'Connor.
Yeah. They were all translated. So, for example, especially one of my predecessors as a translator, Elisabeth Schnack, she published more books than I myself, because she actually translated until the age of 95, I think, or something like that. Anyway,
you're still time, Chris.
Still time. Anyway, the thing is, there wasn't a gap in that sense. There might have been a gap within the Irish literature, that there was a gap of, or a period of silence, shall we say, when it came to contemporary novels. Then the John McGahns, etc., came along. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is, I, did work for this Acclaimed publishing company, but it was non-fiction. It was an encyclopedia of popes. It was a book about the Vikings, etc. My literary career, so to speak, began when I approached the Diogenes Verlag in Zurich in Switzerland, and I said, could I translate the new novel by Ian McEwan? And they said, no, we already have a translator. And then later on they contacted me again and said, but maybe you could edit that translator's translation. I said, with pleasure. I mean, I didn't know anything. With pleasure, I said. And then they said, no, we have another editor, but we have an author here called Bernard MacLaverty, short stories. Maybe you are interested in doing those. And suddenly I found myself in that position that I had craved, being a translator for that very prestigious publishing company. And then it went on from there. But it took a long time to actually find that second publisher other than Reclam. I had said to myself, I give myself 5 years. That's a long, long time as a young man. Well, I wasn't that young. I give myself 5 years in order to find a second publisher, because you have to have a broader basis. And it took 4 years and 49 weeks.
So eventually, just on the act of translation itself, I mean, in one of your essays this is Chris's Bible, a collection called The Burden of Two Worlds, a collection of his translations, pieces of writing on a whole variety of different topics. But one of the essays does talk about translation, and you talk about translations as kind of a tightrope act, where there's always this kind of polarity, between free and literal. But one of the things that you focus in on in that particular essay is that one of the most difficult things of all in your experience of translation is how to deal with dialect, how to deal with regionalisms, how to deal with slang, how to, with language that's marked in a particular way, and that the English and German are very different in this respect. Do you want to say just a word or two about that?
Well, you could actually extend this catalogue of problems. For example, Irish literature as a whole, as opposed to British, or other literatures in the English language. How can you mark for the German audience that there is a particular use of the English language in Ireland because of the substratum of the Irish language, that has informed the use of English on this island. And it's very difficult because German obviously functions in a different way. So how can you actually mark these little differences in the target text? Very difficult. And so in a sense, I sometimes have the feeling you cannot do anything to really carry over those peculiarities, and you have to give in or give up. Now, that is of course then we say water to the mills of those people that say everything gets lost in translation. That is not so. But at the same time, it is true that those particular areas are the most difficult. And especially for somebody who himself, for example, does not have any access to regional dialect, because I never grew up with a dialect. Even my slang is very limited. So that's a problem. And, other people with a different vocabulary or access, might find these things easier. But then again, when I talk to my colleagues, everybody's agreed. Slang, dialect, Hiberno English, all very difficult areas. At the same time, it's very strange when you say free and faithful or whatever. It's a couple of, or a pair of categories that are used all the time, and really, what does it mean? For example, I call myself a literalist in the sense that I want to do justice to the original text by being very close to it, not only in semantic terms, but syntactically. I want to, as far as the German language allows me to, I want to do justice to the syntax of the original as well. And at the same time, that is my personal decision. I'll give you one example. A colleague of mine translated, Lempriere's dictionary by Lawrence Norfolk, and his name is Hans-Wilhelm Haafs, and he had a particular approach, and he caused the so-called Translators dispute, den Übersetzerstreit, about 15 years ago. And that was something unheard of. Something like a dozen translators wrote an open letter criticizing their colleague and his publishers, because this guy had decided that he would be absolutely literal, but not as the German language allows him to do. For example, in the text it says, he stopped in his tracks. So he would translate, stoppte auf seinen Gleisen, as if the guy was a railway carriage or whatever. Or he was tongue-twisted, war zungenverdreht. So that is literalism in the extreme. That is not acceptable. Then we have another counter-example where somebody translated William Gaddis into German, Markus Ingendey, and he says, I don't actually quite get what Gaddis is on about, I write my own text. And he said so openly, and I don't, as you can imagine, believe in either of those things, but what I do believe in is in loyalty, not faithfulness, because that cannot be achieved, but in loyalty that, or for example, our romantic poet Novalis, he says, a true translator is an artist, him or herself, and a true translator has to work according to the idea of the original poet, he says, but also to his or her own idea. We might say spirit rather than idea. So in other words, I have to be true to myself, not only true to the original author. And in fact, I cannot other than be true to myself, because I am who I am. I'm not you sitting over there. I'm not you either. So I cannot force myself to be other than what I am. We are all limited. I have a certain class background. I have a certain gender. I have a certain age. I have a certain region that I come from, etc. All these factors cannot be denied or changed. So in other words, I can strive to be loyal to the text, but in a sense, the text has to strive to be loyal to me as its translator. Do you understand what I mean?
And is there a sense in which, a certain kind of normative development of the German language and German literature, where there's a kind of a distinction that's sometimes made, I think, between Unterhaltungsliteratur, kind of literature for enjoyment, and Ernstlichkeit, sort of serious. Yeah. Does that mean that when you're translating into German, coming from the languages that are perhaps more demotically oriented in their expression, like English, that there's a certain tension there between having to conform to a particular notion of how literary German is written, and then the languages that you're trying to bring in from English, which of course are all around the world, not just.
I would say there has been a development in that direction, as opposed to English literature, where it started, if you like, in the 19th century. In Germany, for example, we would say possibly Alfred Döblin, Berlin Alexanderplatz, there was the first time that Berlin dialect, sociolect, regiolect came into it and was deliberately, fostered. But by and large, in the past we had that distinction, because our classic authors, they strive to be up there in their idealistic realm. And if you like, more demotically oriented literature didn't really come to the fore. But obviously that has changed, and when you now see younger writers, they would be more like the English language counterparts. They would have what we call youth language, Jugendsprache, entering immediately not only the speech of the characters themselves, but the narrator's diction. So there is an opening, if you like, much more so than even, let's say, 100 years ago. But it's true that there was this split between what people spoke in the street and what literature tried to aspire to, stylistically.
Chris, one thing that's very interesting in your case is that you've not just worked with writers in the English language, so English language writers in Ireland, but also with Irish language writers. And I'm thinking in particular, I want to salute his memory here,
Yes.
Gabriel Rosenstock, who was a close collaborator with Chris over the years. In that series of translations that he produced of a number of important leading German poets like Günter Grass, Hilde Delmin, Günther Kunert, Michael Kruger, and others. So what was that experience like? So you have these German poets that Gabriel was translating into Irish, that you were translating into English. So what was it like, if you like, to inhabit that kind of that space and moving between these three different languages?
Well, I would say it was a very liberating experience. Number one, because I was translating into English, which is, as you know, and here, not my mother tongue. So that's something that is normally forbidden. One doesn't do that. But I had, as you say, as a great inspiration, Gabriel Rosenstock. And that dialogue or trialogue between the three languages was great, because Gabriel had German, but not, shall we say, sufficient German in order to judge, shall we say, the nuances of the German originals. And we had, as you know, as you said, these people like Günter Grass, etc. So, authors of high standing. We had 13 volumes of that kind. Anyway, but so I had to sit there with him and I had to explain, every single line of the German poems. Then I would translate those into English. He would have, a very close and critical look, or rather listen, to my English lines. And it was really lovely, because he would close his eyes and I would read out those verses and he would say, Chris, first line okay, but the second line, that word, that stands out, just get rid of it, what I mean? So it was very time consuming, but very rewarding. And then he would basically produce his Irish versions. And so we had trilingual editions with Kosh Kane, which unfortunately came to an end, that series, a long time ago, and even Portugal Snorrick is no longer with us. They're all going. So we have to stand our ground and stay here.
Absolutely. So, there is this experience that you had with Gabriel, working between the languages. Another experience that you've had, and kind of Trish touched on it there in her introductory remarks, is that you have been involved in kind of translating some of these great classics of English literature, Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, D.H. Lawrence, Sons and Lovers. So one would imagine in all of these cases there were earlier translations, so you were kind of involved in retranslation. I suppose the first thing is I wanted to ask you, did you read any of the earlier translations in any of these cases? And if you did that influence you in any way? Was there something intimidating about taking on these great classics of the language and translating them into German?
Yes, maybe intimidating. Not only the originals, but also the fact that there were, in most cases, quite a number of previous translations. Now, maybe one should say, sometimes these new translations are commissioned, so somebody approaches you and says, well, for example, Fitzgerald is now out of copyright, we want to do a new translation, are you willing to do that? But also, for example, I remember Acclaimed, that famous publishing company, they always had a lovely party at the Frankfurt Book Fair in a big villa. And so we would be sitting there, nice dinner, and then the editor was saying to me, we are preparing a new series with a new design, hardcover, We're just wondering, in terms of the English language, it should be classics, what could we do? Then we sat down and I said, well, Virginia Woolf should be done, D.S. Lawrence should be done, blah, blah, Oscar Wilde, the fairy tales. And then, funny enough, these things came about, so I was involved in 3, 4, 5 of those translations. But when you say, do I look at older translations, yes and no. I mean, for example, Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray, I think my translation is the 15th or 16th into German over the centuries, well, over the, whatever, 1.5 centuries, shall we say. So you couldn't actually access them all, and also you would, it would blow your mind. So what I did, I looked at 1 or 2, and I only looked at them when I was hitting a problem, and I thought, how would they have solved that? Then quite often I found they didn't solve it either, but that was comforting after the intimidating experience. So what you do, you try to free yourself of influence, if you like. You try to approach it afresh, and that actually is the purpose of new translations. Namely, we all know that when you have a statue, there's a patina. And when you have an old translation, funny enough, not the original, but the translation has a patina. And the patina has to be removed, so to speak, in order to freshly access the original. I sometimes phrase that like this for myself. I say, originals mature, translations age. And there's a difference between those two developments, shall I say. And it's very strange. Why is that so? Why is Shakespeare, still Shakespeare, although nobody possibly understands him nowadays because the time gap is too big. But at the same time, certain translations of Shakespeare, they age, and nobody would now perform Christoph Martin Wieland's translation of Shakespeare. Whereas, funny enough, our romantics, Schlegel and Tieck, they are still being performed, but there are also new translations. So there is a rivalry, if you like, and possibly the directors, the theaters, and also the audiences have to decide which one is more appealing today. And it's funny how, for example, a translation like the Schlegel-Tieck translation of Shakespeare is, for once, timeless. It is a huge cultural achievement that has, gone into everyday German. Certain proverbs are now, they're doing. So I don't know, but it is strange when you, maybe I should say that, when you read any book, let's say in an English translation, let's say a French novel or whatever, Flaubert was mentioned. Normally we are naive readers. We say, this is the original that I'm reading. We are not aware of the fact that there is a mediator, that there is a prism, that there is a take on that original. And it's only when you suddenly have, as some students at Lüneburg did, when you have 11 translations of The Great Gatsby, and they take a number of sentences and compare the 11 translations. And would you believe it, there's not a single identical sentence to be found anywhere. So you have 11 Gatsbys, 11 Fitzgeralds in German, and none is the true Gatsby or the true Fitzgerald. And it angers me when I sometimes read, German literary critic writing, oh, there's a new translation of Dostoevsky. Now finally we have the true Dostoevsky. That is nonsense. It's a Dostoevsky like all of the others, and in 2 years' time there will be another truer Dostoevsky hitting the market, you know?
Yes, I mean, it's interesting to go back to the kind of our musical beginning, that sometimes people compare translations to, they talk about translation as transformance, you know, performance translation, that basically the original is like a musical score, and each translator that comes along performs that score in a different way, which explains the kind of multiple variations that you get in translation itself. In this book, The Burden of Two Worlds, one thing that comes across in your collection of writings that are not translations is the sense, there's almost your kind of evangelical sense of the commitment to the business of literary translation, and you know, there's obviously specifically the Irish case in championing Irish literature in the German-speaking world. But do you feel yourself that you're translator, but you're also kind of cultural mediator or ambassador? Is that the kind of you talk here? The title of it is The Burden of Two Worlds. Is this the burden?
Well, you see, this is a collection, as you say, of little tiny pieces I wrote in the English language, and the title, The Burden of Two Worlds, is actually taken from a poem by a Turkish poet who writes in German, but that collection of poetry was translated by Eva Berg and Oeser into English, and one of the lines in there is The Burden of Two Worlds. And I thought, well, it is true. The translator, first of all, moves between two worlds, or possibly more than two worlds, if there is another language involved. But it can be burdensome in the sense that you feel neither world really satisfies all your needs. You want one world to satisfy all your needs, and you have to constantly swap over and change over to the other world. I brought out something like this in the German language, and there I call it Im Großen Dazwischen, in the great in-between, which is a line by the poet Paul Celan, which is the same thing. One world here, one world there, and you inhabit the space in between. It's a very lonely space to be in, even though you are enriched by those two worlds, you know. And may I maybe just add some thought that I was once a bursary holder in the Hermann Hesse house, his birthplace, in Calw in the Black Forest. And there was a lovely 3-month period, but we were asked to produce something after the event. So the writers that were there would write a poem or an essay about the Black Forest or whatever, and I didn't have anything to write, so I thought I will look at translation as such, but I will look at it from a philosophical point of view. So I gave the subtitle. Well, the main title was Every Translation is a Mystery, which was said to me by some high-ranking person of nobility, Duke Friedrich of Württemberg, and he came up to me and says, every translation is a mystery. So I took that as the title, but my subtitle is On the Ontological Status of Literary Translation. Now, that is high-pitched. What I meant by this, or what I'm trying to explain there, is that I feel, even though there's a human agency, i.e. the translator, there seems to be some sort of mysterious process of something leaving its own, shall we say, physical, what's Hülle? Exactly, and going to another place. And the funny thing is, when you look at German philosophers, let's say Hegel, Schelling, you know, dialectics, and they have this very abstract language they use, but I think they are onto something when they, for example, talk about Selbstentäußerung, which is very hard to translate. Some people translate it as self-renunciation, others as self-emptying. I call it self-exteriorization. In other words, the original seeks for itself another life, another environment. And some, for example, religious theorists, they say when God created the world, he exteriorized himself because he felt lonely, he felt bored, and he needed something to face him of his own creation, so that if like his divinity would go into the world but would be objectified, you know. And I always have the feeling there is a certain parallel that the original seeks to create another life for itself. And Schelling, for example, then uses these very hard to translate, notions hard to translate. Das sich selbst ungleich werden. How can anyone translate that into English, please? Das sich selbst ungleich werden. Everything in this world has a tendency, or at least the potency, to be something other than itself. And that is basically the sort of constellation between the original and the translation. Now, that doesn't explain anything, but it sounds
Well, it's funny because it's an interesting parallel. There's an old Hasidic version of the Babel myth where the argument is that one of the reasons that God caused the Tower of Babel to fall and for people to speak different tongues was that when they all spoke the same language, they got utterly bored talking about the same things all the time. So by fragmenting the tongues, they finally had something to talk about, or to try and figure out what the other was saying. So it's that kind of thing of.
But it's interesting because the Bible, as we all know, is not a stupid book. It has, addressed many problems with which we are all battling. For example, this particular myth. Had it not been for the Tower of Babel falling, there wouldn't have been any need for translation. Everybody understood each other. Now, after that, translation was necessary. But was it possible? So then we have the opposite or the complementary myth in the New Testament, which is the Pentecost, the miracle of Pentecost, that suddenly Jesus' disciples were able to understand other tongues, other languages. So suddenly it was possible to translate. And it's funny how these two myths sort of complement each other and, in a sense, explain, what's happening to us as the humankind, as the human race, that we do not understand each other, but then we do because we have translators, Maybe one day, I don't know whether you are familiar with that, but when the Soviet Union was still the Soviet Union, there were linguists that taught, because the whole world will be socialist, there will be one language spanning the globe, So it could be, even without socialism, that imperialist English, American influence and all that, will one day, maybe in 100 years' time, lead to only a few pockets of other languages being left. It could well be. Then we don't need translators anymore.
Chris, before I turn to the audience, I was going to ask you. We're talking about the future, what things might look like in 100 years' time, and of course there's the fatal, the big issue of artificial intelligence, AI. What it means for the future of translation. I think one of the reasons I still want to ask you a question about is that you collaborated, quite a number of years back now with I think they're here in the audience, Maeve and Dorothy Kenny, who were using sort of machine-based tools to look at features of your translation style and trying to detect, using these tools, what were kind of recurrent or typical features of the way in which you translated particular text. So you're somebody who's had kind of a sensitivity or an openness to what various digital tools can do. But in the present moment, do you feel concerned, optimistic, indifferent, to what artificial intelligence might mean for the profession of literature translation?
Well, I mean, I myself, but especially many of my colleagues, are very concerned, especially those that work, shall we say, with genre literature, so romance, thriller, etc., where already some publishers say, use artificial intelligence and you will be, if you like, the post-editor and no longer the translator, which of course means that one would earn even less than one would otherwise. I think that's a trend that will be reinforced over the coming years. In terms of what we call Hochliteratur in German, that is more difficult because up to now, as that's my experience, the machine translation cannot yet address the things that you addressed at the very beginning. Rhythm, they don't know anything about rhythm. Certain, things that there should be an alliteration in that sentence, they don't know about that. And apart from that, they are still quite often not quite sure which word out of the lexicon fits this particular context. So sometimes you think, okay, a human translator might make the same error, but I think less likely so. So sometimes you come across a phrase or a word that is so, you're just flabbergasted, But anyway, but obviously these machines or these programs will be more sophisticated. If you think back now, we're in 2021. When did we suddenly all begin to hear about artificial intelligence? Maybe 5 years ago, but not 15 years ago, even though there was already artificial intelligence. So things are accelerating, and I think they will influence our profession hugely. And in fact, already, but that's a different, that has possibly different reasons. Many of my colleagues think we cannot sustain this any longer. We actually leave the profession. We can't live anymore on our from our work, and that will be accelerated, I fear. Mm-hmm. So, in a sense, being a little bit older than, let's say, a beginner at the age of 25, I won't have to fear that, but the younger generation, yes, very much so.
Situation's changing. Okay, at this moment, I'd like to kind of open our discussion, bring everybody in the room into the discussion. So if there's any questions you'd like to ask Chris or Hans, this gentleman over there.
We actually have quite a lively discussion online as well, so if I can start off with a question from online, which has been waiting for about 15 minutes. The question is, out of all those texts which you've translated, does one stand out as being particularly, having been particularly fun to translate?
Particularly fun? Well, I don't know whether fun is the right word. I have certain favorites. Now, obviously, I will only name dead favorites. And one I mentioned before, Oscar Wilde, for example. I only translated, unfortunately, the fairy tales. I wanted to translate his stories as well, but that wasn't continued. I just love him. I love him. I love his texts, and his approach to life, etc., etc. And then, sometimes you are in a privileged position where you can actually propose something to a publisher. So, for example, Edwin Hegel of New Island Books, he once gave me a little booklet called The Visitor by a certain Maeve Brennan. And I read it and I was enthusiastic about it. And I found a publisher and then we went on. And so I think it's possibly a unique thing in the world. We have a 2-volume edition of all her stories, 2 fat volumes. And she is certainly a great favorite of mine.
I had a few questions really percolating, but you completely derailed my train of thought with your comments on AI. But then I realised, because I was thinking of this case in China recently in the appeals court in one of the provinces, which actually found in favour of a worker, a highly skilled professional worker in the IT sector, who was replaced by AI, and the court ruled that that was illegal. I was elated by that judgment because, of course, AI, as you are well aware, is still unfortunately very fluid, dynamic, unpredictable, and prone to illusions of all sorts. So you really don't have the ability to manufacture bioweapons in the hands of everybody, without control. So it's really quite scary. So of course I'm extremely enthusiastic about the EU adopting that. But you actually really reminded me today, and I want to put it to you as a question, that really, in fact, I'm amazed I never thought more about this, really, because I have used Translator. I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I also write songs, so I'm conscious of all of this kind of stuff. But I never really thought of the translator as an artist, which clearly she or he is, because he's actually, or she is, creating a fundamental interpretation. So I would put it to you that in making it illegal for AI to replace a worker, on those grounds alone, surely under EU labour law, we should protect the profession, especially of translators in the literary area. Thank you.
Well, I'm not a legal expert, obviously, so I don't know what laws might be put in place to protect. I have the feeling in the end they won't protect certain jobs, and especially in this particular case now, the job of the translator. For example, these machines, I always call them machines, they're not machines, but you know what I mean. They're fed with words from texts all over the world, the so-called mining. Now, mining is not allowed, but it's being done day in, day out by certain companies. So, for example, if you open a book now, it will always say, we have the right to refuse the mining of this text being published in this book. But who knows? Anybody can do anything. How will you prove? So I think, laws can only. It's a bit like the Luddites. Can we actually stop this so-called technical or technological progress? Is that possible? Do we want to go back to hand weaving? Do we want to go back to hand translating? You know what I mean? We don't know. In 50 years' time, the world might be quite different from what it is even now. So in that sense, I'm a little bit pessimistic.
Just a point of information, actually. Thanks to AI, I actually wrote an article about that. And actually, it only requires a few amendments to EU labour law and some of the directives to actually to make it illegal to replace a worker with AI without offering retraining, compensation, and so on. So it actually legally can be very easily done. But the big argument against AI is how sophisticated it has become, but how unreliable it remains. And obviously putting this incredible power in the hands of everyone, including the sane, those with mental problems, who think they should be ruling the world and so forth, it's absolutely terrifying because there aren't sufficient control. And ultimately, I would put it to you that the real argument for control in the way that I've suggested is because ultimately you are going to transfer incredible power into, give it to a few billionaires to become trillionaires who will have an absurd degree of power over our lives. Thank you very much.
If I can jump in with another question, which is, Chris, how do you feel about writing translators' notes afterwards in your translations? Is that something that you are generally asked to do, or that you like to do, or hate to do?
Well, I have not been asked to provide an afterword to explain my translational strategy or whatever. I think it's a good thing because it would combat that impression that a reader might have that this is the one and only true translation. No, because you can set down your approach or whatever. It would be helpful. Now it is more work, obviously. Unfortunately, I do not normally keep notes. One should do. I agree with the person asking that question. It would help everybody. It would help to sort of order your own thoughts, but it would also inform the reader. It would be a good thing. I do write afterwards, but it's normally on things like this. This, for example, is Claire Keegan Foster in an English language edition for a German readership, i.e. school students, university students, and there I write an afterword, but it's not my translation, it's the original. So I think I should take up that idea.
Hans-Christian, you've already touched on it a little bit, but do you ever defer to a living writer when you want to take a little bit of artistic license in your translation? And if I could give you an example of a dead writer, Chekhov, I was in the course of my work, I was looking at a couple of translations because I won't go into it why, but there was a line that the character of Madame Ranievskaya in The Cherry Orchard says, "My husband died of drink." And then I found another translation that said, "My husband died of champagne," which I found far more interesting and poetic, and it said so much more. So, do you ever find yourself in that situation where you think, "Oh God, maybe I'd like to say champagne instead of alcohol"?
And do we know what Chekhov wrote?
I don't, because I don't speak Russian, so I wasn't able to.
No, if the original.
Clarify that.
Yeah. No, sorry. If the original said in Russian drink,
Yeah.
I would stick to drink.
Okay.
If the original said champagne, I would stick to champagne. But at the same time, I quite like this example because I have a motto, if you like, or a device. I want to intensify. I told you before, when I say something might be a little bit flat, I want to intensify, which means, for example, champagne would possibly say more about that character than
And the
word.
decadence of the time as well.
Exactly. But I don't know whether in this particular instance I would go as far as that. But you see, we are back to that question, you know, are you faithful, are you free, do you deviate, whatever. Everybody deviates, they have to. But to what extent can you do that? Can you falsify? No way. So if champagne is being inserted because, you know, and it's not in the original, then I think it's a certain falsification, which I possibly wouldn't subscribe to.
So when your question was, your counter question was, what did Chekhov say? Was it champagne, was it Guinness? Since you're translating from Peg Sayers, is there a feeling of frustration for translator come linguists that when they're translating from an English translation from Irish into English and you're doing from English into German, that you're translating from the bucket more than from the well?
Well, Peg Sayers is a particular case because I have no Irish whatever, so I use the English translation done by, can't remember the name now. And there is a big problem because in Germany we have, I think, one or two now, I would say, translators, literary translators, who have Irish and translate from Irish. One is Gabriele Haafs, who, funnily enough, is the sister of that Hans-Wilhelm Haafs, whom I mentioned before. And the other one, I can't quite remember her name now. But there wouldn't be anybody else. So it's very difficult. For example, let's say you have a Gabriel Rosenstock poem. Who would translate that from the Irish into German? I did, funnily enough, do a whole selection of his poems, but again, only with his help. So there's a German translation. I also did Padraig Pearse, you know, and he has some Irish language poems, but again, I would have to consult the experts. I couldn't do it. One was this guy. I couldn't do that on my own. But of course, it's a problem, you know. But mind you, you know, there are languages where you don't have translators that could do the job, so there have to be detours via a third language. And it's better than nothing. Silence is always bad.
Gary?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you,
Just wait for the microphone. Gary, just,
Okay.
yeah.
No.
There
I recently read a novel by a female Caribbean author, and then I read The Possible by Dreams by Possible, a black Irish American author, and say Oscar Wilde. Now, if you translated you know, an older Irish author, a modern American black author, and a Caribbean woman author, how would they differ when they're all German? How do you create the feeling that this is American South, same as Faulkner?
Well,
Or are they all German then?
well, yes and no. The first thing is you're quite right in addressing this particular problem. Namely, if you, let's say, translate, I don't know, 100 different authors who are all different from each other, quite obviously. I think you can only do them justice if you stick to this literalist approach, i.e., try to really bring over what's written there on the page. I know it sounds very naive and very general, but still it's true. Only then can you make that Afro-American author sound different from Oscar Wilde. At the same time, what you're aiming at, I suppose, is there is only so much that you can do within the German language in order to transport these various sources. I mean, Jamaican English different from Oscar Wilde's English, quite different. You know, what do you do? At the same time, I do believe that when I, let's say, take those three translations and compare them, I do think that the sound will be quite different, even in my poor German translation. At the same time, we were talking about that before outside, it is still always my language, and my language is the same. It's again the dialectical problem. How can be something the same and at the same time different? But it's true. I do have, let's say, Oscar Wilde in German, and I have, let's say, Ralph Ellison in German, but then I have myself in that German. It's very weird, it's a mystery.
But you don't, there are a lot of immigrants in Germany who, you know, have their own identity, Turkish or Syrian or East European. You wouldn't use their slang or their dialect, or you wouldn't transpose a Caribbean into a Syrian immigrant.
I think you
how
couldn't.
They write.
I
That
think
would be false.
you couldn't, because it would create a completely different context. In other words, shall we say, the black American man or woman, you know, speaking, I don't know where, would not be represented by, let's say, even a black German would speak German. Yes, because it's different language systems, and therefore the deviation from the standard German or the standard English would be a different one. It's a different distance. And that's the big problem. I mean, for example, you know, I don't know, Kanak-Sprech. That's something that even Turkish people use as in order to describe the German they speak. And it was discriminatory, but they actually take it on now, Kanak-Sprech. It's completely different within the system of the German language from, let's say, what Black American English, and there are so many Black American Englishes in the first place. You can't do it. So you always help yourself along with a sort of artificial sociolect that nobody speaks. It's very odd.
I think it's partly sometimes what happens is connotation. I remember one time listening to somebody speaking about the German translation, the first German translation of Judah and the Pig, the Plan of Stars into German. And so what the translator did was to choose a Berlin working class dialect for the working class characters in Plan of the Stars. But the audience reaction was one of unimpeded hilarity, because they thought this was a scream. Why are these Berliners suddenly so exercised by the cause of Irish independence that they don't know and die in the streets for it? You know, it seemed like a weird kind of category confusion. You know? So you'd be very careful about how you transpose things. You know, in different contexts.
And maybe I can add, you know, Ralph or Rafe, I don't know, Ralph, I say Ellison, the Black American author, he had been translated to German, The Invisible Man, or Invisible it's just called, by Georg Goyert, who also translated Ulysses by James Joyce. And I was asked to revise this existing translation maybe 50 years afterwards, which I did. And then there was a conference about Ellison, and there were some black people in the audience, and they said to me then, well, first of all, how can you, as a white man, translate a black man's work? That's one thing. But also, how should you not have had more black German? Like that was your question, black German. I don't know what black German is. I find when I listen to a black person speaking German, their German is immaculate. As opposed, for example, to a Turkish person who quite often does not have the proper endings in, and that might have to do with their own language, you know, in their own countries. I have no idea. I'm not, as I say, a linguist. So it's very difficult to come to terms with those dilemmas.
Yeah. Great. I'm conscious of the fact that we've kept Kristen more than an hour now, and but I think you'll all agree how fascinating it's been just to get even the smallest of glimpses into Chris's life in translation, and I feel certain that whatever about the advances of AI, although sometimes your productivity is such that one suspects that somewhere secret in the back room is some kind of AI apparatus machine, and Chris is hallucinating in a very, very effective and convincing way. So